This is a PowerPoint on the Great Depression, and the photo that you see here is from Detroit, which is one of the hardest hit cities during the Depression. People were starving to death on the streets of Detroit. Uh, there were danger signs in the late 1920s that a lot of people didn't pay enough attention to. Everybody talks about the stock market crash as being the cause of the Great Depression. That was one cause, but it's much more complex than that. The prosperity in the country, although the 20s are considered generally to be a prosperous decade, the prosperity was very uneven. And this meant that a lot of people didn't have the money to buy the things that American manufacturers were producing, which in the long run is a problem. Some people bought too much. They borrowed too much money and they accumulated a lot of debt, which was also a problem. Um, and as most people know, there was a lot of speculation in stocks, buying it, thinking it's going to go up, and when it did go up, getting very optimistic, very willing to take risks, and sooner or later the bubble was going to burst. They were going to crash, and that was one of the problems of the late 1920s. Um, as I said a minute ago, there was a lot of overproduction because a lot of people weren't making enough money to be able to buy what companies were producing. And this was true in automobiles and in the construction of new housing. Um, Now, along with this, there were falling farm prices um, that um, made farmers the least prosperous group in the economy. Now, let's talk about the stock market. Stockbrokers would sometimes allow investors to put up 20% of the value of stock, and they would loan them the other 80%. Sometimes it was even 10% and 90%. And the stockbrokers did this because they wanted the business and they were confident that stocks were going nowhere but up. Uh, but if they went down, then people could easily get wiped out because they were what they were losing was borrowed money, and the brokers, of course, wanted that money to be paid back. Um, Now, the stock market, it's often said, is motivated by two factors, by greed and by fear. Um, and whichever one is stronger will determine whether the market goes up or down. As long as it seemed like there was unlimited amounts of money to be made in the stock market, then greed took over and people bought stock. But the moment that they were afraid that this was all coming to an end, they sold, and lots of people sold all at once, and that is what caused the crash. Um, Now, the stock market crash took place in October 1929, but that started or added to a whole chain reaction of events. There were bank failures, and this is a time when bank deposits were not guaranteed. If the bank went out of business, you lost your money. Today we have something called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. That was put into effect in 1933 by President Franklin Roosevelt, but that didn't exist in the early part of the Depression. Um, and then banks were so afraid of the situation in the economy that they cut down on loaning money to businesses or to anybody who wanted to buy anything. And that made matters worse. So there was a reduction in purchasing because people didn't have any confidence that their income would be solid, that they would be able to continue. So they cut back on all sorts of consumer purchases that had been driving the economy in the 1920s. Now, Congress wanted to protect American businesses. They had good intentions, but the way they approached it was not very effective. They passed a very high tariff called the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, and this simply dried up international trade and made matters worse. The Depression affected the whole industrialized world. Uh, Now, to make matters worse, farmers who had already not been doing well faced drought, long periods without rain, and this eventually is related to the Dust Bowl, which we'll get to a bit later. Now, between the year 1929, when it began, and 1932, if you look at these numbers, they're appalling. In 1929, look at the numbers. But by 1932, the total national income was cut by more than half. Um, U.S. exports were cut dramatically. Farming income was cut by more than half. So, you just take a look at these numbers to get an idea of the extreme consequences of the Depression. Um, Now, the bottom came in the winter of 1932-1933. Unemployment was about 25% nationally. That's an outrageous figure, and that doesn't even consider underemployment, where people would have their hours cut back, to little 4 hours a week, 8 hours a week. They couldn't live on that. And in some cities, it was much higher. Unemployment was 30% in Detroit, 60% in Cleveland, 80% in Toledo, Ohio. They're known for glass, and the glass would be used in auto production and housing construction, building construction, and those businesses had just fallen off the table. Um, and in that period of the early 30s, over 4,000 banks failed. That means everybody who deposited any money in those banks lost it. Uh, this was, so even if you had done everything right, even if you had saved for a rainy day, you probably would lose it anyway. Um, the response of some people, Ford workers, was to march on the Rouge plant. Uh, but 5 of them were killed by the Dearborn police who guarded the border from Detroit to Dearborn. There is more on this in the video, A Job at Ford's, the second part of that video that you will be assigned to see. Uh, the uh, the Hunger March was simply an expression of extreme desperation. People who didn't know anywhere else to go or anything else to do, and there were people who were actually starving to death in Detroit. Now, across the nation, people who lost their homes to foreclosures were just throwing up shanty towns, shacks like this. This one is in Seattle. And you see, this is just the most desperate poverty imaginable. Here is they're called Hoovervilles because, of course, the president was Herbert Hoover. And this was a very sarcastic term. It was entirely clear that Hoover would not be reelected in 1932, and he wasn't. Here's a Hooverville in New York City. Uh, Here's another one in New York, and one in Detroit, um, in Chicago, all over the country. Now, there were World War I veterans who marched on Washington in 1932. They called themselves the Bonus Army because they had been promised a bonus that they would be getting in 1945 in return for their service in the war. They wanted it now, though, because they were worried that they couldn't make it to 1945. But the Hoover administration handled this horribly. They sent the U.S. Army to march on the so-called Bonus Army and to simply burn down their little Hoovervilles, the shacks where they were staying. And you can see the U.S. Capitol in the distance, not far away, as the army was just destroying the little bit that these people have. Um, there were bread lines. All they could get, bread and soup, bread and soup. Uh, and I don't know how many of the people standing in front of this billboard realized the irony of it. You still have this promotion of this happy, prosperous, healthy, middle-class family. Look like maybe they're on a family vacation with the heading "World's Highest Standard of Living," and there are people in a bread line. Uh, Here are unemployed men getting soup. Uh, the Depression produced a lot of really amazing photography. Some of the best was done by the photographer Dorothea Lange. This is the most famous of those. People who were affected by the Dust Bowl, many of them migrated to try to get agricultural work in California or somewhere on the West Coast. Uh, this is a photo that just shows the desperation of a mother and trying to figure out how to feed her children. Um, More from Dorothea Lange. Oklahoma was very hard hit by the Dust Bowl. The agriculture was destroyed there. Um, this is more of her work um, and more. Just the utter despair that this brought to so many people. Um, and then again, um, what people had to endure. Um, Parents wondering how they were going to take care of their children. Another prominent photographer during this time was Walker Evans, uh, who has a different style, and he forces us to face the subjects of his photographs directly. Um, you get a wonderful sense of the texture of life in the 1930s from Evans. Um, Now, I mentioned the Dust Bowl. These were overwhelming dust storms that covered everything, that made it impossible to practice farming. There were towns on the plains, like in Oklahoma and Kansas, for example, where these enormous clouds of dust would come and just inundate everything. Um, and what was left? Uh, Nothing that was productive. Here's another one. And you can see how the dust buried so many things. Now here's a map of it. Uh, you can see that um, the orange area is the worst part. The Texas Panhandle, the Oklahoma Panhandle, parts of Kansas and Colorado and New Mexico. But the yellow areas were severely affected also. And those red lines, those arrows are the paths of migrations of people. The most common one was to the agricultural areas of California. If you've seen the film or read the novel, The Grapes of Wrath, this is about this migration of a family to California.